This is the story called The Boys' War. Confederate and Union soldiers talk about the Civil War. We're reading chapter 8, and it's called Prison Bars and the Surgeon's Saw. We have a picture here, and it says, as troops assemble to march into battle, an ambulance crew prepares for its day's work. In order to be efficient fighters, boys in the Civil War had to put their normal fears and worries aside. This does not mean that they lost all of their emotions. Far from it. These boys worried about a great deal: where their next meal would come from, their abilities and courage of the officers directly in charge of them, or how to get a good pair of shoes, to name a few. But there were several specific concerns that were shared by all young soldiers on both sides. One was the fear of being lost among the great crowds in which they marched and fought and died. It was not uncommon for an army of 50 or 100,000 men to look across a battlefield at an equal number of the enemy. This was nothing at all like home, where everybody knew the boys' names and faces. Here, a boy was just another body, no more important than the person next to him. There are many accounts of boys separated from their companies while either marching or fighting, who spent days and weeks trying to find a familiar face. The biggest fear, however, was of being killed and not of having their bodies identified properly. This was not as odd a fear as it might seem. After a major engagement, the battlefield would be a confusing, chaotic mess. The ground would be pockmarked with hundreds of craters, the result of the ceaseless cannon and mortar fire. Bits and pieces of shattered trees, cannons, and wagons would litter the earth, while the black smoke of burning buildings and fields created a murky and choking haze. Frightened and wounded horses galloped over the landscape. Injured soldiers screamed for water or medical attention. A few wounded soldiers might be seen stumbling to find help, their shirts and pants saturated with blood, and some still clinging to a severed arm. What seeing such a sight might have felt like was captured by young Fred Grant, who had accompanied his father, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, during the siege of Vicksburg. The horrors of a battlefield were brought vividly before me. I joined a detachment which was collecting the dead for burial. Sickening at the sights, I made my way with another detachment, which was gathering the wounded, to a log house, which had been appropriated for a hospital. Here, the scenes were so terrible that I became faint. And making my way to a tree, sat down, the most woebegone 12-year-old in America. The minute the shooting stopped, the men who had just fought in the battle went hunting among the churned up land for their comrades living and dead. Thomas Galway did this after the Battle of Gettysburg. As for us, we have been attending our wounded and have been picking up such of our dead as we could recognize. Each regiment selects a suitable place for its dead and puts a headboard on each individual grave. They attend to this chore with much as care as they could muster. They would, after all, want the same attention paid to their remains, but it must have been nearly impossible for the exhausted soldiers. For instance, when Grant's army drove towards Richmond in the spring of 1864, it suffered more than 61,000 casualties. Confederate records have not been preserved, but the South must have had similar losses. The dead who could not be identified, as well as all of the enemy dead, were consigned to a mass unmarked grave. As Galway makes clear, The unrecognized dead are left to the last, to be buried in long trenches. The corpses are brought into rows and counted, the Confederate and Federals being separated into different rows. At the feet of each row of 50 or 100 dead, a trench is dug about 7 or 8 feet wide and about 3 feet deep, for there is no time for a normal grave depth. Then the bodies, which are as black as ink and bloated from exposure to the sun, are placed in the shallow ditch and quickly covered with dirt. We have a picture here, and the caption says, "A crowded Union cemetery at City Point, Virginia. Only the graves in the background have markers to identify dead soldiers and their regiments." Thousands of soldiers would die alone and be buried without proper religious services and in shallow graves. No one would ever know how they died, and no one would ever be able to visit their place of burial. They would be lost forever. No wonder that the Confederate soldier E.D. Patterson worried more about home than about the wounds he suffered. "I thought of home far away. I wondered if my fate would ever be known to them. I had a horror of dying alone. I was afraid that none of my regiment would ever find me, and that with the unknown dead who lay scattered around me, I would be buried in one common ground. The thought was terrible. How I longed for a day, just that someone would see me die." We have a picture on this page, and the caption says, "A nameless grave at the base of a tree at Antietam." To die alone was something every young soldier feared, yet those who managed to survive battle but were taken prisoner or wounded might have preferred that fate to the one that awaited them. For if aspects of the fighting represented a shift to modern warfare, the treatment of prisoners and the sick and wounded was something directly out of the Dark Ages. While anger and embarrassment at being captured may have helped these boys add drama to their accounts, their suffering was real. Colonel Davis called it the Black Hole of Calcutta. John Delaney said of Fort Henry, the prison he was taken to after being captured at Gettysburg. Our settling down consists in spreading our blankets on the filthy floor, and though many of us are wounded severely enough to merit beds, but one or two are given even bunks, and these are glad enough to leave them to their former occupants, the vermin. Supplies of all kinds were lacking, and many boys reported having to get their blankets and clothes from the bodies of dead men. Food, always a concern of the soldier, was in even shorter supply. Union soldiers voiced the same complaints about their prison conditions. One boy managed to scratch out a fast description of one of his meals. "Huh, rations at last. One coarse meal cracker and a small bit of bacon, one ration." We are informed that these rations were used in advance for the following 24 hours. Useless to protest. We had but one remaining right, the right to submit. "That's the best we can do. We are short of rations for our own troops," said the major. "Most of us devoured the 24-hour rations in advance at one standing." These wretched conditions were made even more hard by overcrowding. The worst Union prison camp was in Elmira, New York, and contained 9,600 prisoners inside a 40-acre enclosure. The southern prison at Andersonville, Georgia, is considered the most fiendish. It was a 16-acre stockade camp designed to hold 10,000 prisoners. But by August of 1864, more than 33,000 had been crammed within its walls without any shelter from the hot summer sun. Elmira Prison Camp in 1864 after tents were replaced by permanent structures. The bottom picture, a view of the crowded Anderson Stockade in Georgia. A Confederate boy visited the Andersonville prison and came away with these thoughts. The prison struck me as being, at best, but a miserable makeshift. The day I saw them, they were a sweltering mass of humanity, each unit of which was confined to a space of not more than 20 feet. This of itself, the crowding of 32,000 human beings so thickly together, was sufficient to make the prison unsanitary. But that was not all. I saw whole carcasses of slaughtered animals being cut up and made ready for distribution. The refuse which fell into the creek, together with the filth that washed away into it from the hillside during heavy rains, necessarily contaminated the water. I venture to say that on the day I was at Anderson, fully 1,000 were in the hospital, and that nearly as many more were sick in the stockade. I don't know exactly how many died that day, but in all, probably 100 at least. For according to the hospital records, the average daily death rate for the month of August 1864 was fully that number. The conditions at Andersonville were so bad that it became a death camp. Of the 45,000 Union soldiers who were imprisoned there, over 13,000 would die of sickness, malnutrition, or exposure. After the war, the commandant of Andersonville, Henry Wirtz, would be tried and executed for war crimes, the only such trial to result from the Civil War. How did these boys manage to survive the ordeal of imprisonment? No doubt their strong, young bodies helped them to endure the heat or cold. Many used their imagination and skills. After telling about the lack of food and water at his prison, Point Lookout in Maryland, one Southern boy noted the prisoners carried on all kinds of business. Some made finger rings and breast pins out of a gutta percha, a rubber-like substance made from tree sap, toothpicks and trinkets of different kinds of old bones. I myself was engaged in making crude jewelry, from the proceeds of which I was able to purchase many luxuries, such as cornmeal, coffee, sugar, and tobacco. We found ready sale for such stuff, principally among sympathizers on the outside. Many took a more direct approach to getting more food, as this Union boy's diary entry makes clear. September 13th, 1863, rats are found to be very good for food, and every night many are captured and slain. So pressing is the want of food that nearly all who can have gone into the rat business, either selling these hard animals or killing them and eating them. There are numbers in the drains and under the houses, and they are so tame that they hardly think it's worthwhile to get out of our way when we meet them. No doubt most of the prisoner's time was spent searching for food and clean water or trying to make himself comfortable. Despite these struggles, many tell of evenings filled with the singing of popular songs or religious hymns. Another source of recreation one boy mentioned is a quiet promenade during the cool hours of evening. Then you may see hundreds of promenaders passing up and down the prison enclosure in a quiet, pleasant, but melancholy converse. This is a picture, and the caption says, "Prisoners at Belle Plaine line up to get rations from supply wagons." Activity in prison was low key and energy saving. But John Delhaney did note one intriguing game that seemed to have captured the fancy of many of his fellow prisoners. The prisoners nearly every evening are engaged in a game they call baseball, which is notwithstanding in the heat they persecute with persevering energy. I don't understand the game, as there is a great deal of running and little apparent gain. But those who play it get very excited over it, and it appears to be fine exercise. While life in prison must have seemed like a living hell to those who were captured, the worst fate was for the wounded and sick. The weapons used in the Civil War had 10 times the killing power of those used in the Revolutionary War. Flesh were ripped, eyes were punctured by flying pieces of metal, cannon shells severed arms and legs with ease, and because metal helmets were not yet worn, head injuries were very common. Unfortunately, the doctor's ability to treat these wounds or simply to lessen the pain was primitive at best. The science of doctoring was still in its infancy when the Civil War started. Morphine and chloroform were used to ease pain, and when these ran short, whiskey and bourbon had to do. Iron pokers were heated until they were white hot and then applied directly to wounds to stop the bleeding. As if a wound to an arm and a leg seemed too severe or became infected, the usual course of action was to cut off the limb. After one battle, Alicia Stockwell came up this scene. We moved on to the east side of town where they were fetching the wounded. They were laying them in rows with just room to walk between. They had tents for those that were the worst off, and they were amputating arms and legs. There was a washout back of one of the tents that had a wagon load of arms and legs. The legs had the shoes and stockings on them. Even minor wounds might end up with what we would consider very drastic treatment. While imprisoned, John Delaney happened to meet a Union Army surgeon. He was a very fine looking man and has his hand in a sling, for yesterday, when operating upon a gangrened wound, the knife with which he was operating cut his finger slightly, and fearing infection, he was very sensible to have his own finger immediately amputated. Most soldiers look upon the doctor's work as useless mutilation heaped on top of injury, and the fact that large numbers of the injured would linger in agonizing pain for days only to die did not enhance the reputation of the medical profession. One boy, obviously very angry, wrote a blunt condemnation of what he was witnessing. I believe the doctors kills more than they cure. Doctors ain't got half sense. Some of the wounded at Mary's height waiting to be transported to the hospital. Unless absolutely necessary, most soldiers would stay far away from doctors as possible. Treat themselves as best as they could. Teas made from the bark of slippery elm, willow, and dogwood trees were favored remedies for anything from a cold to infected wounds. Wounds were treated by daily cleaning and removal of anything foreign. A busy Union Field Hospital at Savage Station, Virginia, 1862 is the caption of this picture. Today, wrote a young soldier with several wounds to his leg and back. Shepherd, who is most kind in his attention to my wounds, extracts, therefore, 4 maggots and cleanses the wounds thoroughly. They are also doing very well now. I mean, my wounds. 1 week later, he writes, Shepherd extracts from my wounds several pieces of my pantaloons that had been carried into my leg by the bullet and which worked themselves back to the surface today, taking 22 days to go a distance of about 2 inches. All of this was done without any sort of painkiller or antiseptic. Surprisingly, this boy recovered from his wounds. While bullets and shells accounted for tens of thousands of injuries, more Civil War soldiers were felled by sickness and disease. The sanitary conditions of the camps and prison were deplorable. Drinking water and food were often contaminated. In addition, this was the first time these men had lived in such large groups which facilitated the spread of fever. Dysentery and diarrhea were the most common diseases, but malaria, pneumonia, bronchitis, and scurvy were also common. Oddly, measles, a disease we consider relatively harmless, turned out to be a major problem for boys in the Civil War. Once the disease took hold, it could sweep through a camp in a matter of days. One gathering of 10,000 new recruits was hit by measles, and before the week was out, more than 4,000 had contracted the disease. The disease was so common that it became standard procedure to withhold new troops from active duty until they were put through the measles. The treatment for all of these diseases was bed rest and plenty of liquids. Even so, one statistician estimates that more than half of all the deaths of the Civil War were caused by fevers. A boy, J.W. Love, may have summed up the situation perfectly in his letter home. T.J. Friedman is dead, and they is several more that is dangerous with the fever. They have been 11 died with the fever in Co. Since we left Hinson and 2 died that was wounded. So you now see that these big battles is not as bad as the fever.